Hello, this is Max at Cryptosophy for the specialist number two. I'm very excited for this one. This one, rather than a specific career, we will be talking about a lifetime. And I am joined by Amin Salah to talk about growing up in the Middle East and moving to America. Amin, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I wanted to start with a short bio of where you grew up and the places you lived in the Middle East.
Yeah, sure. So I've moved more than the average Arabic guy. I was born in Palestine, and I only stayed there till I was 3, and I don't remember much from it. And then we moved for a year, about a year and a half, to Egypt, Cairo, and then from there me and my family, went into Saudi Arabia. We lived in multiple cities. So we lived in Dammam for a couple of years, and then we lived in Riyadh for the biggest time, which is where I grew up, and I remember most of my childhood there.
And what was the cause of the three moves?
Oh, mainly my dad's work. My dad is a doctor, which you don't think of as a traveling job, but he also liked to do other things, and he never was completely content in the same job for a long time. So we kept moving with him as he was trying to find better jobs and different jobs, different in different places. Yeah.
Hmm. And do you know what is it being a doctor like in Palestine, at least
Oh,
20 years ago?
well, he was a doctor in the time of what we call al-intifada, and that was the uprisal, the second uprisal against a lot of transgressions by the Israeli state and the populace, the Palestinian populace did a civil uprisal, and a lot of injuries were coming in at that time that had to do with protesting, respiratory problems. So he had to deal with that a lot. But other than that specific year or so, it's quite calm because we lived in a village. It was the village where he grew up in. It's a farming village, an agricultural village, and yeah, it was pretty calm. He'd do home visits. All of this is his stories. He'd tell me stories, so I'm just relaying stories that I don't actually remember this. But he does home visits, and the village people come to his clinic sometimes. It's pretty laid back. Nothing like a hospital in New York or something like
Hmm. Cool. I do want to come back to Israel and
that.
Palestine because it's very interesting. But you've lived in the United States now for several years, and I'm wondering how you might contrast growing up in Saudi Arabia and going to school with your perception of what American life is like for kids.
So you want me to compare between the life in Saudi Arabia, basically, for kids growing up and kids growing up in America, right? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Well, I think it's vastly, hugely different. I mean, an example I can think of off the top of my head is a few days ago I went with the niece of a friend of mine to her school. She had a Fun Fest Friday. She's only 7 years old, right? And they have this really nice carnival outside for kids, and there's a child version of relay, like they're hunting rubber ducks in a blow up swimming pool. It's very the classic child fest you would imagine. Growing up in Saudi Arabia as a 7-year old is very different than that. We especially in Riyadh. At that time, now it might have changed, but at that time, we don't do as many activities outside. A lot of it is indoors, and when it is outdoors, it's after sunset, and it's usually hanging out in the parks as guys and smoking hookahs as early as 11 and 12 years old. Um, we fight a lot, just to pass the time. We'd have fighting contests even as kids, very physical. I cannot like we don't have as much of a the classic childhood interaction. Like I never had to ride a bicycle down the road with my friends, right? I've actually only recently learned how to ride a bicycle because we've never had these kinds of activities. Especially for people like me, and by people like me, I mean somebody living in an apartment, middle class, no specific backyard or front yard or like a green space where you can go out to on a daily basis. So I'd say it's quite different.
Hmm. And was your education involve any religious teaching?
My education, oh yeah, for sure. We had so just to give you more information because I feel it, my experience might be not as representative as what the case is. So I'll just explain generally, then I'll speak specifically about myself. So generally, in public education, in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis that go to public education, they have to take multiple courses in regarding religion, and one of them is the text, which is just reading the text and memorizing parts of it. There's tafsir, which is analyzing the text, and there's hadith, which you study what the holy men said, including the prophet and his family and friends, and all the wisdom they imparted onto the Islamic world. You have to memorize it. Uh, there is tarbiyah, which where you learn the ethics and morals of the Islamic culture. It's all from a religious perspective, obviously, and so it's a very heavy on religion in the public sector. In the private sector, it's completely different. We are limited to one course, and that course repeats itself throughout the 12 years of school, elementary, middle, and high school. And it's just reading the text, memorizing parts of it, and reciting it to the teacher. Much lighter. And that was my experience with Arabic education in regards to religion and morality in general.
Hmm. And I know you're now no longer religious. Was there a transition there while you were growing up that you began questioning or doubting the validity of the Quran and the teachings you were being given?
Yes, there was. So I remember a very specific event. It wasn't the point at which I said, no, not this. This is not me. But it just as the years pass on, it becomes more salient as a memory. And that was we had a mathematics teacher. She's supposed to teach us mathematics, but for about 10 to 15 minutes each class period, she would tell us religious stories, and they were scary stories. I mean, we were at that time. Let me think. We were 11 years old, and she would explain to us how God punishes a thief, for example, or somebody who's never prayed. And she'd give us a visceral description of how the angels pull you out of your grave and then basically punch you into the seventh earth or some weird stuff like that. It's just very visceral, very scary for children. And I remember being pretty scared. And I went to my dad and I asked him if he's ever prayed because I was so scared that's going to happen to him because I was aware he wasn't religious, right? But he said, "Yeah, I've prayed when I was a kid." So he tried to. I think he noticed and he tried to make me feel better about it. But that memory just paints this negative fear emotion I have towards religion, and I am a generally slightly more nervous than your average person. So this kind of feeling towards a constant thing in your life is definitely not healthy, and I realized that early on. And I think slowly my brain pushed it further away. It wasn't till later that my logic caught up to my emotions, where it cemented my belief in um, the lack of belief, actually, in organized religion.
And was that while you were still in Saudi Arabia?
Hmm. Yeah, I was still there. I was definitely still there. It's pretty isolating as an experience, but yeah.
And was there like a specific set of ideas or something you studied that sort of catalyzed unbelief, or was it just a slow progression of?
I think as everything in life, especially in change, it's very gradual. You don't notice it yourself. But as I say, like as things become more, as memories become older and the person becomes more nostalgic, just certain memories stand out, and you're like, oh, that was the point. But there isn't really any eureka moment.
Yeah. Was your family religious, and how religious were they compared to the society that you were living in?
My mom is pretty typical in the sense of how she was brought up, and I think that still is apparent in much of her superstitious beliefs. But she is not a religious person, or she, at least if she does believe in God, she doesn't consistently practice the religion. My dad is a complete, I would say, less than 1% minority. He's a militant atheist when it comes to religion, and I wouldn't describe myself as a militant atheist, but he definitely is. He is. If you wanna hear him rant for 20 minutes, just mention the religion.
And how did he get there growing up?
Oh,
Where
he had a specific. Oh, he loves stories. So he had a specific story where he was like, "That was the point when I transformed." And for him, I think this, according to the story, how it goes is that at one point they were saying in the text in the Quran, he was reading in class, and one of the surah, one of the words of God in the Quran said, وَمَا خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَ وَالْجِنَّ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, which means we have only created jinni and humans to worship. And he was like, oh, there is much more to life than a life of worship, no matter how you analyze it. And so I think for him, that was the last straw.
we saw it as like a servile position.
Yes, and he is. Yeah, he does not like to be bossed around. He's very much like you, actually, in that sense.
Yeah, I mentioned talking to Doyle about the Pope, that I have a heretical nature. Awesome. So, when was the first time you went to the United States, and what was the experience like? Was it shocking? Had you always wanted to go?
I have always wanted to travel outside Saudi Arabia, and as a kid, for many reasons, I was not able to go further than Jordan and at times Dubai. And so I wanted to go, of course, to America, not just for like the classic, I want to go to America. I really just wanted to leave Riyadh and Saudi Arabia behind me. And that's, I definitely did look forward to that experience. And it did deliver. It delivered in ways I did not expect, for sure. Um,
What was the main reasons for the desire to leave?
it's just how marginalized you are when you carry a certain um, set of thoughts. When you have a certain way of living, a certain way of thinking, you're very marginalized. And I'm not talking only about religion, I'm saying generally. Um, you know, it's a very macho culture where men don't feel, men don't think, where every joke is a banter, everything is very shallow, and everything is quiet, not fake, but it's, you have to understand it's a collective society. So keeping up appearances is very important, and it constitutes 70% of your conversations, which I could not do. In Arabic, I'm much more an introvert than I am in English, and much more quiet because of that. And I've never felt like I can fit in, especially with the guys.
Hmm.
Like girls would have the same thing, but when I hang out with girls, you know, more expressive, a little bit more loose, I felt, and I could communicate with them more. But when it comes to men, and it's a men's society, so you have to interact with them all the time. I just could not. I could not really find the connection there.
Where does the male sort of masculine society come from in Saudi Arabia?
I think it's goes further back than religion. It's a very Bedouin, really Arabian thing where the man is macho and the woman is delicate and soft. I cannot tell you exactly what is the point in culture, but it's if an analogy helps in this case, think of Latino culture. We are very much like them in the sense of macho men and delicate women.
I know you have brown skin, but you're going to get called racist for that.
That's all right. I've been called worse. I can live with it.
So, at what age did you first make it into the United States, and what city
I was
did you go?
17. I My first stop was Newark Airport in New York, and yeah, if that answers your question.
Was there like a culture shock there? Was it like, oh, like I walked into a different universe, or were you rather familiar with the
Well,
States?
I don't know. There's something special about New York. Even now, going back, it's not much of a culture shock. I don't know how to describe it. So I don't know if you know this or any of the listeners would be recognize this, but Isaac Asimov wrote a book called Prelude to Foundations, where he describes a giant universe with many planets, right? All of them colonized by humans with various different cultures. But there is one planet where it's the hodgepodge salad of everything in the universe. That planet, and that was New York. I felt I walked into one of Isaac Asimov's novel, where that was the planet he talked about. This is New York. Everything is huge. There are almost no Americans. There is every other nationality. Nobody speaks English, but people speak Slovenian. They'll speak Arabic. They'll speak Spanish. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Um, I feel like New York is in some sense more representative of the United States in that way.
Mm. Yeah, definitely.
So you went to a private high school, right?
Mm. Mhm.
After
Yep.
the public middle school. Um,
I had public kindergarten, but everything after that, all my 12 years of grade school was private.
okay.
Mhm.
And I know, so there's a lot of, human rights coverage about the religious police and the nature of the regime. What was it like living under the theocratic regime of Saudi Arabia? And like, was there specific things that maybe an American just couldn't imagine happening?
Yes, yes. I have a story. I was stopped for wearing shorts under my jeans, which is they call it غربلة or التشبه بالغرب, which means westernization, which apparently is not liked by God, and therefore they are allowed to stop you and send you to the police department. And it wasn't just me; it was me and two of my friends. One of them was wearing shorts without anything over it. That's how they caught us, because he was wearing shorts above the knee. Above the knee is not good. Below the knee is good. So he was wearing, soccer shorts above the knee, and that's how we got stopped. And they checked all of our the inside of our jeans and found that we're all wearing above the knee shorts. And lo and behold, we are in the police station, reprimanded.
It's very. I mean, I was wondering if God mentions westernization in the Quran.
He does not. He does not mention a lot of stuff actually, but apparently he meant to say it. He just forgot or something.
As Christopher Hitchens once said, "I'm not here to tell you that God didn't write the Quran. I can only hope that God was having a bad day."
Oh,
And there was mandatory religious ceremony time too, right? Where you could get
oh yeah.
caught when you should have been in mosque.
So 5 times a day we have prayer, and it's dawn, noon, and then afternoon, sunset, and night. So during all these times, except dawn, which is too early. So for 4 times a day, all businesses have to close down completely, and everybody has theoretically has to go to a mosque and pray. That's not what practically happens. It's not what happens anymore. A lot of these things, a lot of authority has been taken out of the religious police, especially lately with the new king. But when I grew up, that's how it was. They closed down. You have to plan your day around the prayer times if you're hoping to achieve something.
And I'm pretty sure you told me a story about a friend you had who got picked up during mosque time on the
Oh,
street.
Hmm.
They asked him, "Why aren't you in Mecca?" And he responded, "I was waiting for you guys." So they kicked his ass and threw him in the back of a van.
Oh yeah, he was just looking for trouble.
And did
um,
he get out and say that was worth it?
I think he got out and he boasted about it, so he was pretty happy he did it. But he got his ass beat. Got a few whips, but his dad was pretty quick to come to the police station, so it wasn't very bad. And they give you a lot of tapes about religion that you have to listen to, and books, and you know, it's just I don't know. But yeah, that's his story.
So, what percent of the population would you estimate doesn't really believe in the state religion?
That's the creepy thing I find. That's the creepy thing about Middle Eastern culture. I'm an Arabic man, and I'm proud to be an Arabic man. But there are some creepy things about this culture, and that's like I said, keeping up appearances. I don't know. That's how good we are at lying. That's how good we are at lying to other people, and we're even better at lying to ourselves. Uh, I know one of my friends is a Saudi man. He was studying in the States as well. He is not religious. He's very much like me, in the sense of related to religion. But when he went back home, just to keep up appearances, he would lead his coworkers in prayer. He would ask them to go to prayer during prayer time. Yeah, I don't know. It's just very complicated.
It's a full show. And
Yeah.
has like the introduction of technology such as smartphones and then the social apps therein changed the authoritarian nature of the regime more? Is the society becoming more open than it was, say, a decade ago?
Society is definitely getting more open a decade ago, for sure. Does the media have to do something with it? Probably. I mean, most probably due to globalization, right? That globalization is the cause of almost every cultural change, that and economics. But I think on the face of things, when you ask people, it's not Twitter that changed it, it's the new king. The arrival of a new king who's young and wants change and implemented the change. But that change was happening a long time ago. And I think media, for me at least, media did lubricate it. Yeah.
Hmm. That I mean, it's I feel like there's a very different picture of Saudi Arabia that we get given in the West than is the case.
Mhm.
There's a lot of claims of Islamophobia and things like that,
Mhm.
um, along the lines of not judging the society, but all the while, the United States is a very close ally to Saudi Arabia.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, I'm wondering, especially in light of the election the United States just went through, what politics was like in Saudi Arabia. Like, were there parties? Did people talk about politics? And did you sort of have political views growing up?
There are parties in Saudi Arabia in as much as there is alcohol, and that is saying there is none whatsoever. There is almost no politics either. In for the lay people, at least. I'm sure there is more politics for the royal family and the people in the parliament, but the people don't get a say in anything. It's not a democracy. It's a monarchy. It's a functioning monarchy where the king does everything and owns the land. So when a company wants to buy something, they buy it from the king directly. And the people, when this is the case, uh, you don't find many varying opinions. And if there were, they're definitely not voiced. And when they are, these opinions disappear very quickly and very discreetly.
Hmm. And was there a general consensus on an opinion about the United States or the West more generally?
I mean, I think it's kind of like it's like a weird sexual fantasy where you say, "Oh no, that's too weird. I don't want it," but deep inside you're turned on by it. I feel like this was America to Saudis and some Arabs in general. It's something. Oh, America. If an American comes to the Middle East, he's well paid, he's respected. But then again, in politics, oh, America is the devil. It's the main source of evil. So it's very um, well, some cognitive dissonance in there for sure.
Mm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I grew up, as Aristotle says, as a kind of political animal in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And, from probably, it was in elementary school. I think it was in fourth grade. I was arguing with a girl about a presidential election. So there's
You
never
started
been
out early.
there's never been a time in my life where politics wasn't present in some way. Uh,
Mhm.
I really couldn't imagine what that would be like. It's sort of like everything's taken care of, but at the same time, nobody can voice an opinion or have a say different than the way things are.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, as a Saudi, you. I don't want to say you have an easy life, but there's a very strong social net. There is some unemployment, obviously, and poverty. But if you're a Saudi, it's so easy to get a loan. Everybody wants you to work. There's a mandatory Saudization of companies, where companies have to fulfill a certain percentage of Saudis in their employee workforce. They get education almost for nothing. They get paid, or at least used to get paid almost $2,000 a month to come study in the U.S. Uh, I mean, it's pretty comfortable, and I'm not surprised they like the monarchy, because so much money is shoved down their throats so that they can't think anymore or speak for that matter.
Hmm. And slightly off kilter, do you remember the day and impact of September the 11th?
Oh yeah, I remember it very clearly. Um,
What what was that like?
I was how old was I? I was in middle school. I can't pinpoint my age right now, but I remember seeing it from through the kitchen hallway. There's like a direct line of sight to the TV, and I remember I was that far and I saw it. And what attracted me is how my parents were huddled around the TV. They were both standing and looking at the TV very close to it. So I'm like, what's going on down there? And I remember it didn't have much emotional impact, but that emotional impact slowly increased, especially after the invasion of Iraq. Because that was an almost direct result of 9/11, and the significance of this memory, as I said, increases with time.
And what was public sentiment at the time like in Saudi Arabia?
Public sentiment was fear. I mean, the supposedly the superpower, definitely the superpower of planet Earth, just got one of its iconic cultural structures knocked down by a Muslim. There's just fear from everybody, really.
Mhm. So it wasn't hatred or celebration in any way.
No, no. I mean, when people talked about it, they were just like, "What's the U.S. gonna do now? Are they gonna just decide to erase every single Muslim on the face of Earth?" Like, there was a lot of worry, and I think a lot of it was valid, as we saw in the consequences of 9/11.
Yeah, it was also a very different geopolitics at the time.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Is there any political propaganda in Saudi Arabia? State-run media, or there was certain
Yeah.
information you don't have access to?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. If they want you not to have access to any piece of anything on the internet, they can simply block it. Because for the longest time, the phone services and the internet services were provided by the government, by a public company called STC. They privatized it, I think, 10 years ago or something like that. But for a long time, it was just the government controlling everything.
Hmm.
So censorship, I mean, yeah, they can definitely censor it. Propaganda, I mean, honestly, propaganda is everywhere in the Western media, in the Eastern media, in Saudi Arabia, in Iceland. There's probably propaganda. It's just as humans, we cannot be completely objective, and that definitely comes out when we try to present objective news.
Hmm. But wouldn't that be, I mean, at least given things like the religious education a kind of moral equivalence that wouldn't make sense? Or do you
But
think the media by and large in the United States is, as missing the mark as the information you get in Saudi?
well, I think we talked about this before. I think our main disagreements come from how much. And I think this is again one of them. Like, I don't think the American media are off the mark about American politics as Saudi are about Saudi politics, but they are much more off the mark when it comes to international news, much more even than some Eastern news media. It's it's just sad, to see that kind of thing. And a lot of it comes from, I don't know if it's lack of information or a certain agenda or some sort. I don't know what the fuel and engine behind such misrepresentation of international news is, but it's definitely strong.
I think there's also the aspect of the United States being both the world's biggest superpower, or at least it was before the political commentator. That's not a great way to describe him, but Ian Bremmer said we are now in a G0 world. There's no longer political polls. Um, but I think geography might have a lot to do with it too, in the sense that there is Canada, where everyone's polite, nothing bad or interesting ever happens, and Mexico, which is just part of our domestic political conversation. And
Sure.
the first time I traveled outside of the United States, I'm actually struggling to remember where it was. I think it was Scotland. There was a weird shock to me that there was an entire world out there.
Yeah, yeah, that's another thing. See, Americans, they're pretty lucky because this country, geographically and space-wise, has everything a planet has to offer. From the oranges of California to the Rocky Mountains to the boring plains of Indiana. There's everything. You never have to go anywhere to Alaska. I mean, it's just the fact that so many things are different, so many subcultures are different as you travel geographically makes it an entire world. And I get it. I get why Americans are so absorbed in it. So, if I may say, ignorant of everything outside. I mean, yeah, I get it. If I was an American, I'd probably be absorbed in it too. So that's why I said, is it an agenda or is it a lack of information or is it just they have other things to worry about? Yeah, I keep it open for further discussion.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I think just sort of my intuition here would be that it's all of those things.
Probably.
It's like
It always is.
it's like if you hear someone's traveling to Indonesia in the United States, that is probably the first person you've ever met that's an American that's doing that.
Right, right.
Not like you can hop on the train and cross the channels from the UK to Paris.
Right.
There. Um, but I also think in another sense, um, it's sort of like the United States, if you take a realist interpretation of international politics, gets to set the world agenda, or at least it did.
Mm.
And I think that sort of aura post World War II, of having a unipolar world
Mm.
allowed Americans to just focus on capitalism and economics and internal politics because the government, especially under people like Clinton or Henry Kissinger,
Mhm.
was doing all of the international work, and we weren't even necessarily supposed to hear about it.
Right, right. Hmm.
It's very, I mean, it's a weird position to be in. We have a mutual friend from India who speaks, I don't know, 9 languages, and um, he's been to. I wonder. I bet it's over 20 different
Oh yeah,
countries.
he's been around. I asked him this question before. I forgot what his answer was, but yeah, he's definitely been around.
Yeah, and that's just, I mean, on a middle class salary in the United States, it's like I'm not saving up $4,000 to go to. Africa or the Middle East or something like
See,
that.
that's the thing. It's not just that. I mean, an Indian in India, India is huge and it has way more people than the US, but still, an average Indian knows more about his surroundings than an American. There's just something else extra in there that adds to the like, oh, America, who cares about the rest?
Hmm.
I don't know what it is. It's not necessarily intrinsically evil or something like that. Like, I'm not trying to portray it extremely negatively. It has its pros and cons, but it's definitely not just being middle class and needing to travel further. An Indian knows more about Hawaii than American knows about Hawaii, which is funny because it's the 50th state, right? So,
Yeah. I mean, to your point earlier too, it's probably economic in a different sense, in the media sense. I mean, given just how free the US market tends to be, um, and maybe it's the American attitude
yeah,
about not
definitely.
caring.
I
It's
mean,
we
I
want
go.
to sell stories as a news agency if we're going to talk about social policy in Indonesia, or
Mm,
a change in policy in Saudi Arabia so that women can drive. I mean, that did make it in, but you know what I mean? Like, that's not going to drive clicks. That's not going to get commercial.
right, right.
So
Which
I think
is
that
which
could be
is
part of it too.
yeah, which is an interesting segue to capitalism versus something other than capitalism, because the idea that wanting the better for everybody comes from laissez-faire and wanting the best for yourself is not always the case. Sometimes this pursuit leads to things with less quality and truth in them, and I think that's definitely a weakness of a free market.
Yeah, it that would be an interesting thing for elaboration in your life story. Did you find in Saudi a more intellectual or perhaps worldly approach to things than, say, in the people you met in the United States? Is there,
No, no,
there
that's part of my problem with that's part of why I couldn't connect with many people in the Middle East. And I thought I'd solve it by coming here, but it's still a problem. You don't find many people with something to say. You find a lot of people talking, but it's very difficult to have a genuine conversation about anything really. So, if I mean, even an educated person, a person can hold a PhD. I mean, I graduated, right? You graduated. So anybody can graduate from any system by following the rules. Doesn't mean they are the better person for it. It certainly is an opportunity to better yourself, but not necessarily. And many people do not take that opportunity. And you can see it. You can see, doesn't matter what they're holding, what kind of piece of paper they're holding, you'll find a lot of people with absolutely nothing to say.
mm. Those are that leads me to interesting questions. What is something that Saudi Arabia does better than the United States?
They have a better healthcare system. That's for sure. Especially for Saudis. They don't have to pay much for healthcare. I'd say just general social support. It's better. You're going to find this consistently in collective societies where the support system is always going to be better than individualistic society. And yeah, that's definitely one of the things they have that beats America.
Hmm. Yeah, I wonder what that might look like in the United States. I mean, you see collectivist families, sort of.
Right.
Like, my girlfriend's family has like an extended family of 150 people, and various weekends over the summer they go to a lake cabin or sets of cabins, and so
Yeah.
kind of large community of people. You sometimes see this with cultures too. There's large Italian communities or large Greek communities, or Latina communities.
But
Uh,
that's not fair because when you talk about Italians, Greek, and Latino, they are literally just a collective society dressed in a Latin language. Uh, they really are. We can see that in Miami. If you go to Miami and you see the Latin community, you're not gonna think this is an individualistic society. There is no way. And I think just to elaborate more, I mean, even though you said your girlfriend is living in a collective like family, right? But still, by our standards, that's not collective enough. Like the family is integrated into your life, daily life. If you fail, it is expected of the uncle to help you if the father cannot. It's culturally expected. And if he does not, he's looked down upon by everybody else. What else? If the family is just much more integrated, which is good, but also bad because you don't have as much space to think or breathe.
Mm. It's sort of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it definitely. I think everything has some pros and cons. It just depends on what kind of life do you want to lead. Do you like being surrounded by people who care about you all the time, but you also have to carry their responsibility? If that's you, yeah, you'd enjoy a collectivistic society. But if you're an introvert who likes to, some days spend 24 hours in his pajamas and think by himself and eat cheese slides, I mean, then that's not for you.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. Armand, who he's also going to be on the specialists, which I'm very excited about. Hopefully this weekend, if we can get back together. Um, he really struggled with the way that humans relate to each other culturally in the United States.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm sorry to divert the subject a bit, but like, yeah, he's a perfect example, and I want to use him as an example. Like, he loves being. He's an introvert, right? But still, he loves being surrounded by people with meaningful connections, right? He could not find that here. Here, by here, I mean the United States. He couldn't find it. He couldn't connect with people. Not because he says it's because nobody's listening, but I bet you there are some people that care about him and actually listen. But I think it's more about a cultural difference. Is what he expected of the society is not what it could offer and support as an individualistic society. But he found that back home. That's good for him. That's great.
Yeah,
For me, I could not balance being an introvert and connecting with people. He could, I could not, and that's why going back home is never going back home for me. It's always a test of my patience.
mm. Yeah, and the other interesting thing there too is he is he's a pretty strong extrovert when he's speaking in Hindi.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
in the United States, he looks like the shyest, most withdrawn kind of guy. And not in class. Apparently, he managed to annoy a lot of his theology teachers. But
Not Madar though. Madar liked him.
um, yeah, what like I'm trying to think of how to get more at the American Saudi distinction in your experience. Um, is there a good way to describe the living in the United States versus the living in Saudi that is like the most consequential to your choice to want to be here?
Hmm. So I'm gonna try to connect this with what we were talking about with Armand. I forget what this quote who it was and how it exactly went as, but the general idea is to have another language is to possess a second soul. And I think that's very accurate. Being completely bilingual, being able to think in two different forms of in two different languages, really gives you a second personality. And I thought coming into the States, I felt like I released the other half of me.
Mm.
It's kind of like one of my souls when I learned English as a bilingual was entrapped, and it was released as I went into the States because that's how I think. When you think in that language and you go to that country where people are thinking in the same language, it's just a different part of you comes out, and I think that's true for many bilinguals.
How would you describe the two parts of the soul?
It's I don't know how to say it without sounding borderline pathological, but it's like having two different sets of personalities where in that language your personality changes to fit the culture that gave birth to that language, and that switching between these two, although it's seamless, right? Because you're bilingual, it still shows up in your attitude of speaking, of your mannerisms. For what does it feel like to me? I can't describe exactly what it feels like. It doesn't feel like anything really. Just it happens, but the effect is definitely noticeable.
Hmm. Would you, I mean, I've known you for some time, and I'm wondering if you would describe the Saudi version as more disciplined and um, rule-based, willing to listen to authority, and the English side as more poetic and expressive.
Yeah, that's how it goes with me, which is interesting because Arabic is a romantic language. It's up there with French and Spanish in its romanticism, and its phonetics are definitely musical. But for some reason, I think this is where nature versus nurture comes out. The nature says that, but the nurture, where I didn't like an authoritarian theocracy, just attached to that language some negative things that the creative part of me just could not deal. But while in English, there is more freedom, and my brain can run more freely and be more creative. I can read better in Arabic. I can listen better in Arabic, but I can speak better in English. I am a shit listener in English. I can write really well in English. So it's just these differences.
I think that's fascinating. I think we need new in the DSM-6. We'll add in a split personality by.
Oh no, I do not need another another diagnosis.
um, so I don't want to make this a cliche rah America statement. So take this as objectively as you can. But
Mhm.
what does the United States mean to you?
Hmm. The places, I don't know. I find it difficult to connect with places. I'm a very sentimental person, which is surprising that I can't connect with places because you'd think a sentimental person would like take a picture of his hometown and carry it with him. But I'm not that guy. A city is a city, and it's really the people that make it or break it. So
Hmm.
if America as an idea was attached to many things, attached to becoming a doctor, attached to studying, attached to freedom, attached to drinking and eating bacon at last. But as a place, as a physical place, it doesn't really matter that much to me. Not that I don't care about it, but you know, I'm, I don't know if you get what I'm trying to describe.
No, I do. I've actually encountered this among a lot of immigrants that I've met that had these sort of maybe naive view of the United States, that it was this pseudo utopia of
Right.
opportunity, an
Right.
amazing thing. And then they get here and they're like, what the fuck are these people doing?
I mean, yes, yes, but you'll get that, but then you'll get the story of a Pakistani bachelor who could not find a job and came to the U.S. and worked as a cab for 20 years, and now he owns his own house and his own tiny cab company. There's so many things that can happen in the free market with democracy. It's just insane. So I think people with expectations that carry their expectations where they go will always get disappointed because reality has an infinite number of possibilities, and it's your chance of being correct 100% and fulfilling your expectation is infinitesimally small because the possibilities are so great. So I don't know. It's just a common thing when people have expectations.
Yeah, certainly. It's interesting that um, you wanted to leave Saudi Arabia to get away from the theocracy and a lot
But
of.
but but mainly to eat bacon. But
Oh, yes.
yeah.
um, but then you don't see the United States as, more than, in some sense, the city in which you live and the people,
No,
your friends.
no, no. I've always thought of myself as a nomad, really, uh, a modern nomad, because I don't know. There is no place where I feel like home. There are moments where I feel like home. There are people where I feel like home with, but there's no place that feels like home. Like there's no place that like, oh yeah, that's where I want to grow up and and have kids and retire. So I don't have that place.
Hmm. Maybe your Arabic personality has one.
Maybe.
What do you think is the most common misunderstanding by Americans about Saudi Arabia or the Middle East generally? Whatever's more interesting.
I think one of the most common misunderstandings is that Saudi Arabia represents the Middle East. Saudi Arabia is definitely the loudest country. It's definitely the richest, and that's why when you think of an Arab, you think of a traditional Saudi dress instead of anything else. But they are less than 10% of the Arabs that exist in the world. The biggest representative of the Arab culture is Egypt, but we rarely ever see Egypt in the media. And I think the appropriation of Saudi culture to Middle Eastern culture is the biggest misunderstanding because they can be very vastly different. A Lebanese is nothing like a Saudi in the way they live. An Egyptian will a typical Egyptian might not get along with the way a Jordanian lives. It's just I think yeah that would explain my thought.
Is there a one on the opposite side, a misconception that's the largest one for people who live in Saudi Arabia about the United States?
Oh yeah. Hmm. As a guy, as a man who grew up there as a teenager, the land of pussy. I think that's the biggest misconception. Like people, Arabs who think of America usually also associate it with um, a lot of partying and sex and stuff where they can like be free. And I think that's partly true, but they forget that the U.S. is more conservative than Europe, and I think that's an interesting misconception there. I mean, they're definitely more open and free with their sex and gender, but it's not how a lot of Arabs picture the Americans to be living.
You mentioned sexual repression in Saudi Arabia to me before.
Whew, yeah,
Uh,
that was.
what? How does that manifest in Saudi Arabia?
How does that manifest? Picture five guys on a couch. They're all 13-year-olds, and they're all watching the same porn video on the same laptop next to each other. That's the definition of sexual repression. And I mean that happened. I was there. People, we would have when we first hit puberty, we would have like porn parties where we go to the guy with the laptop because not all of us had a laptop, and the guy with the hotspot, which can unblock many blocked sites. And then we would like watch porn with him and take turns jerking off in his bathroom, which is pretty effed up. But I never felt completely comfortable. I went to one of these, maybe two, but I knew some guys who did it on a weekly basis. They would go to each other's house at least for a couple of years. After the shock of puberty passes. But so
Mm.
that's what sexual repression. That's what happens when your school is segregated, when it's illegal to walk with any woman that is not family, when it's illegal to talk, to look at, to touch, to even think of a woman that is not from your family. It will either lead to incest or sexual repression, and I hope it's the latter.
Mhm. And that's just, I mean, the dress codes for women is it just the hijab?
No, no, and I mean it's just it's the hijab in many Arab countries, but in Saudi Arabia specifically, it's more than that. You have when I was growing up, at least. Now it's more loose, but when I was growing up, you have to wear a kind of black robe on top of your clothes, and the robe has to be very baggy and not tight on your body, and you have to cover your hair lining with a black scarf. Even if you are have a hijab, you have to cover it with a black scarf because it's colored, and you're not supposed to have anything colored. Uh, some women go even further. They wear black gloves and cover their face completely. Some women cover their face except for their eyes. There are the various variations, but the minimum is black hairline scarf, black robe that covers you from neck to toe, where only the hands are showing.
It's probably not the most useful thing to wear in 120-degree weather.
I don't know how they do it. The women over there, man, seriously. I mean, I wore it once as a joke, and I was in an air-conditioned house, and that was, I mean, I sweated like a pig. But yeah, they do it. They probably wear lighter things underneath, but I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do not to get arrested by the religious police.
So, what are Saudi women restricted from doing that men aren't?
See, that's the thing that I'm most regretful about. I didn't get much into the Saudi community as I would have hoped to. The women, getting to know a Saudi woman is very difficult as a foreigner in Saudi Arabia. Very, very difficult, especially if you're a teenager and you're not a Westerner. You're an Arabic foreigner. It makes it very difficult to really get inside the Saudi house and get to see how Saudi women live. But from the stories that I hear, they're restricted in they can't drive. It really depends on the family. So some families, you do whatever, do you, but don't break the law. Which is a lot of things, obviously. And then other families believe that women only go out on two occasions from their house, and that's one time to marry their husband and the second time to the cemetery. You have the entire spectrum there. At one point, that's definitely before my time in the 60s and 70s and the early 80s, they were paying Saudi families to send their daughters and sisters to school because Saudis were so afraid to send a female outside and leave her for an entire day unsupervised by a male. The government actually paid a monthly stipend that wasn't a stipend; it was more like a salary for the females to attend school.
And I'm just trying to think about what the psychological or emotional impact of that kind of isolation might do, and if you saw any of that in the female population.
See, I hear stories. I mean, I can tell you them, but since I've never experienced them, I can't really say they're 100% true. But for example, a Lebanese friend of a Lebanese family friend, he's much older than me. He runs an art gallery. And I mean, he says there's more sex happening in the Saudi household than there is happening in Paris or Amsterdam on the red light district. I mean, he said the only time he ever had sex twice with two different women in the same day was in Saudi Arabia. And he's been around. I mean, he's an artist with an art gallery, so he's definitely been around. It's not only him. I mean, this is an extreme example, but I hear this a lot. I hear this from many older men who lived and worked there. See, I only grew up, but men who actually worked there and got involved in the Saudi life, that they tell you the women they are just as repressed as the men and just as wanting to be sexually active, and they actually do it because they're so they're so pushed into a corner where nobody wants to deal with them that they just kind of do everything in the back with the back door, behind the back of their parents and stuff like that. Yeah, it happens.
It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that dynamic is kind of terrifying too.
Well, yeah, it all goes back to what I said was creepy about this culture. My culture is that keeping up appearances, being able to lie to everybody in your life, including yourself, just to keep up appearances. It's just creepy, and it leads to this kind of behavior. I mean, I don't know. When you put so many rules on a human being, it's not that they become oppressed. It just means that more rules are being broken, because the human mind, the human soul, if I may say so, will will eventually do what it wants to do, no matter how many rules are put up. The more rules you put up, the more of them get broken. And when you have a collective society where everybody cares about these rules, then you'll get more breaking rules and more lying. And that's what happens.
Hmm. And what's the punishment if you got caught having premarital sex?
It varies. So back in the 50s and before the 21st century, it probably was more severe. So this is more of a personal story. a family member. I'm not going to specify who, but an older person. He had a girlfriend, and he was caught, and he was apprehended by the religious police, and he was whipped 180 times over the course of 3 weeks. He had to report back to the station, get whipped a few times until he accumulated 180. And he had to attend religious school for 3 weeks. He had to listen and take religious quizzes and tests at the police station. It was terrible. And then after that, his family had to like kind of smuggle him out of the country to a different one where he could, not be killed. But that was back then. When I was growing up, you'd probably get held. You might get whipped if your family doesn't have any contacts. So contacts is always a key word. If you know someone high up in police or government, you're scot-free. But if you're from a family with modest needs and you get caught like this, you're going to get whipped a few times. You're going to get held in jail for a few days. But after that, they're going to let you go.
Is there a class system in Saudi Arabia?
Classes exist everywhere, but there isn't a class system in the same sense as the caste system in India. There's definitely classes. You've got the royal family, you have the rich people, you have the well-off, you have the middle class and the poor, like any other society, but except with the addition of the royal family, that being like the super rich. But yeah, that would sum up how the society is economically divided.
And how often does bribery occur in that system of contacts?
I mean, do you want to achieve anything there, from getting your driver license to putting through a business deal? You're gonna bribe everybody in your lifetime in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East in general. We don't call it bribery. See, that's the thing. We don't call it bribery. we sometimes call it a tip. We sometimes call it lubricant. We sometimes call it an incentive. And it's funny, we have a religious name for it too. We call it something, I forgot, sa'i. Like when you seek something for someone, you deserve some reward, some life, like some material reward. That's how religion decreed it, and they have a name for that too. So we call it many names, but rarely bribery.
Bribery is a euphemism.
Yeah.
When you since you've been in the United States, like what has most significantly changed about your worldview?
Many things. I think it has less to do with where I am and more to do with who I met and how my brain developed. I mean, some key people that I met that my worldview changed is you and Arman, obviously. Some of my professors, some of the classes that I took, believe it or not, completely did change my worldview. Sorry, was your question what changed it or what changed?
I mean, we could do both.
Okay.
What changed it?
Okay, so that was what changed it. What changed is everything. I mean, I can't put it down in a specific. I mean, I'm still me, but so much different at the same time.
Would you ascribe that more to adolescence or actually to being in a different place?
I can't put it down. Usually, people, the normal life story of people is that they hit adolescent and they grow out of it, and then they have life changing experiences, right? But for me, and actually for many people, they don't take that traditional route. I had to deal with my adolescent changes because I came here so young, and at the same time, deal with a changing environment. So I don't know which changed which, but definitely it was almost a metamorphosis, I would say.
I wanted to move on to some politics because this is, of course, the only time we hear about the Middle East. So you were born in Palestine, and do you still have family in Palestine?
Yeah, Yeah, I have family in many places, but yeah, I still have family.
And how do you view the current situation between Israel and Palestine?
Well, I don't know where to start. I really don't know where to start. I mean, do the Palestinians deserve their land? Yeah, definitely. Does the newly born Israeli who knows nothing but Israel in his entire life deserve to be kicked out of his home? No, he doesn't. He really doesn't. It's a really messed up situation caused by a lot of things. But I think there are definite transgressions on both sides, and I think it's slightly misrepresented. Not well, slightly, no, it's pretty misrepresented in the Western media as extremist as um, some of the Palestinian views can be. The Israeli ones are just as terrible and just as disgraceful for a country that claims to be to follow uh, an egalitarian democratic framework for their way of life.
The main argument I've heard here from conservatives is that um, Palestine being ruled, at least in part, by Hamas, um, is represented by a terrorist organization who, in their charter, wants to destroy Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then the argument goes on to say any moral equivalence between the Jewish democracy and um, the what Hamas's vision of the world would be if it were to come true is nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
How would you respond to that argument?
Yes, sure. Well, I would say that the difference is not so huge. We have seen the Israeli army in action in Gaza. We have seen the Israeli invasion of Beirut in the 80s. We have seen the war with Egypt. It's not such a high moral ground that they're holding. It's definitely higher than a terrorist group, but that's not saying much. If you're comparing yourself with your moral standings to a terrorist group, you're really not doing that well. As for Hamas, they're delusional, they're corrupted, and they're insane. I mean, if you there in history, there was never a force that destroyed another country. Never. The destruction is always either economic or cultural. There was never a brute force destruction. There is occupation, but then what comes after occupation? Either retreat or you become emulsified in the culture. So they're definitely Hamas. I do not agree with anything they say. I support them in that they defend Gaza Strip against further occupation by Israel, but other than that, we uh, part ways.
Mm. It's very much the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, lesser of two evils kind of moral situation.
It really is. It really is, and I don't know which one's Trump. Really, I mean, uh, I
Yeah.
mean, I see how it looks like from the Western point of view. You know, Israelis, they're white in the end. They came from Russia. They came from Germany. They came from Europe. They're white, and I see for Westerners, they're gonna see them as more civilized, and they're gonna expect them to be more civilized and more developed than Palestinians. But the actions, not as a people, but as a government and as an army, has been much less civilized than what has been portrayed or what has been expected.
Yeah. I think there's also a religious aspect to that too. And
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
post Crusades, the
my
world had to confront scientific facts and um, the anti-Semitism that led to Nazism was
right.
finally discounted. And so I think Christians in the United States now see what's called Judeo-Christian values
Mm-hmm.
as the sort of centerpiece to small L liberal democracies.
Yeah.
And I think the alliance, I mean, it's a strange alliance because it's religious in one sense, but in another sense, it's sort of this complete moderation of religion. where the history of anti-Semitism and Christians hating and killing Jews, particularly by
Hmm.
one verse in the Gospels,
Hmm.
is erased, and a lot of the people seem to assume that Jews and Christians are natural allies, whereas Muslims are, the
The
full
enemy.
perversion of the monotheistic tradition in some
Right,
sense.
right, right. Definitely agree with what you say. Um, but to bring it a little bit back to what we were talking about in religion in general and comparing the two, I think my biggest criticism of Israel, it's not going to be the war, not crimes, but at least humanitarian transgressions. And it's not going to be any of the moral things they do, but it's the fact that they announce themselves to be a country for the Jews, a Jewish state. I
Mm.
think in the 21st century, you don't hear the U.S. say they're a Christian state. I mean, even if they do, they're branded as a specific kind of conservative. You don't hear a Parisian say he's a Christian Paris. That stuff doesn't happen. I mean, yeah, you hear a Saudi say Saudi Arabia is a Muslim country, but that's the level that Israel is at right now. They're not developed. They're not egalitarian. There is no divorce between the church and the state. If there is on paper, there isn't in practice because they announce themselves to be a Jewish state. They are just as good as Saudi Arabia when it announces itself to be an Islamic state. And that is complete nonsense when you consider the amount of globalization that's happening right now.
Mhm.
It's they are also delusional. I mean, you cannot kick out and erase all the Muslim and Christian Palestinians that live in Palestine. You cannot be a Jewish state. You can be a state. It can be Israel, but it can't be the promised land and we are better than you and you're a second-rate citizen and we're gonna build a wall. It's not sustainable
Uh,
morally.
did Mexico pay for that wall?
We might have
Yeah.
cocaine.
The distinction I've heard on this is that there's the sort of Zionist camp, which is Israel is a Jewish state, and the most extreme elements think that by bringing enough Jews into Israel, they will catalyze the coming of the Messiah and the end of the world, which
Well,
is, a bit terrifying.
yeah. Right,
Don't want to believe that when you have
right,
nuclear weapons.
right, right. You'd hope
There's a different group that defends a state for Jews,
not. Hmm.
which is different. Like the United States is a state for Muslims in that sense.
Right.
Um, but I don't know. I want to push back here, and I know
Sure.
we've had wonderful late night debates about this before. Some
Colorful.
in yelling matches was quite enjoyable. But I mean, there are Palestinian members of the Israeli parliament, for instance.
Yeah. I mean,
But
why?
well,
Oh,
I'm just like, if I feel like we're making another false moral equivalence, and I could be completely wrong about this.
sure, sure.
Um,
But I agree with you. And that's where I go back to a specific sentence that I said. On paper, this
mm,
divorce between the church and state exists, but in practice, it doesn't. You go to it's live stream, watch the Israeli parliament. When an Arabic or Palestinian parliament member speaks, everybody leaves. Every Israeli leaves the parliament. What kind of democracy is that? They don't want to listen to the
mm,
Palestinian speaking. Sure, their laws forced them to accept him being voted on the podium, but they're not listening. I mean, isn't that opting out of democracy?
that's,
Isn't I mean, it exists, but they're not interacting with it. The democratic framework definitely exists in Israel, but the Israeli politicians, at least for the greater part, are not interacting with it. When it comes to other Israelis, sure, yeah, they like their elections, they get elected, they have the parliament. But when it comes to Palestinians, they are treated as second-rate citizens. They're not even recognized as citizens. They are recognized on paper, but are they recognized in practice? No, they're not.
yeah, and I mean, there's a lot there to go off of. I mean, if what you say is true, then the Israeli politicians are the type of triggered social justice warriors that think their position is not should not be subjected to criticism, and that would be
Yeah,
kind of pathetic and pseudo democratic ideal of how a parliamentary system should work.
right. I agree.
Um, I actually wrote a paper on Israel Palestine. I think it was mainly on the cycles of violence, but I think the strangest thing about that conflict is how long it's been going on and
Hmm.
how the longer it goes on, the more insurmountable it seems. It's the the historical record has created two perfect tribalisms that like Chelsea and Arsenal couldn't have imagined.
I mean, we have an example. We have Ireland and England as the main example. Except the Irish were smarter in fighting back, and they did achieve some success in protecting their land. Um, I think that's a perfect example where you have two people eternally fighting, and they'll always not like each other. The British will never. They'll like a French, but they'll always have some snarky and cynical comment about the French, and then the French will do the same. Uh, what other examples do I have? The Germans and the French will do the same as well. The Russians and the Japanese.
But it's not in the same way.
It's not in the same way, but I'm saying these are age-old conflicts. This is a relatively new conflict. The state of Israel started in 1948. Now let's look down the road 200 years. It's going to be pretty much like that. It's going to be like Japanese having culturally ingrained hatred towards China, or English and the Irish, or English and the French. I think that's the only resolution to the conflict is time. Time will emulsify both cultures. It will end up being an Israeli state. The Palestinians will force their way into their place into the way of life of the Israeli, and it will just be a bitter rivalry that is historically and culturally ingrained. Sorry.
I mean, it's fascinating how human beings are able to ascribe their emotional hatreds to things that happened before they were born.
Yeah, definitely. See, that's the thing. That's the thing, though. That's the thing. It's not only before the reason this is such a complicated thing. It's not before they were born. So many Palestinians have their homes um, taken down by bulldozers because they don't have a permit that's impossible to get as a Palestinian.
Yeah.
So many Palestinian farmers have lost land. It's current. It's not before they were born. But in general, yes. In general, we do have a cultural memory which we carry with us, unfortunately.
Yeah. I just mean in the sense of, if you are, I mean, you grow up into a world and then told its history. And
Hmm.
Muhammad and, um, the Old Testament prophets had never been around, you would wonder whether or not there would be a source of that kind of hatred
Hmm.
too. And I don't know, this sort of goes to Sam Harris's idea that what we believe about reality really matters. And if you believe that God wrote different books, it's going to be very hard to converge on a common project.
Hmm. So to add to that, to expand on it, I think Sam Harris pushes a kind of a call for people to stop thinking like that, right? And I would wish them to do. I would hope to point that everybody finds that they are not bound by culture and history in any shape or form, right? Because that is the ultimate freedom, to be free of your ancestors. Um, but for some reason, we can't do that, and I think it's explained pretty well by Carl Jung, an Austrian psychologist, who said we have a cultural history, and that goes into everything we do. It shapes our subconscious, and he was kind of a break off of Freud, and he believed that all of or most of our unconscious or subconscious is driven by what we have been taught is history of this specific society or this specific culture. And I think in that sense he's pretty right. I mean, it's just there's no way to go about it except by creating some utopic education.
Hmm. But this might seem like a transition, but we can connect it completely. Have you experienced racism in the United States? And do you think that the United States still lives with this Jungian sense of, the unconscious of our past?
Hmm. So let me just plug in a criticism for liberals here. So the Western, especially American liberals, believe the white man to be racist and like irrevocably evil in terms of discriminating races. But I have experienced more racism back in Saudi Arabia as an Arab by other Arabs than I have in America as a Arab international with other completely different human beings from a different race. I think in comparison with the world, the US is pretty accepting. In comparison with Europe, US is pretty accepting. I mean, the Netherlands is a beautiful country, but you cannot live there if you do not ascribe to every form of their life. They're not racist, but they're pretty closed when it comes to their way of life. The Americans are not. An American wants to try hookah. An American wants to have falafel, and they want to try that Italian lasagna. They're because they were born as foreigners and as internationals, not in the sense that they're not American, but in the sense that at some point in time there was no America, and that wasn't so long ago, and that allows them to be much more open to other races. Is there racism? Sure, there is. Did I experience it? Yes, I have. Is it really that bad? No, not even close. Not even close. And compared to everywhere else on Earth, it's not. It's not really.
What was the specific racism that you did encounter?
I mean, it's more. It's more like for me, it's very mild. I mean, I have brown skin, quote unquote, but I'm pretty white looking. I speak English well, so I wouldn't experience it as much. But I definitely felt the blow of a strong arm of the law. And if I was a white guy who was with white people at that time, I would have been let go with less punishment. But I feel like I got the full extent of the punishment because of who I was with and because of who I was too. Um,
Yeah, this is
I'm trying
about
to.
a
What is it?
certain Colorado slash California plant.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, I've heard so many stories from white guys and women too who have been caught, in the act. We weren't smoking at that time, but they've been caught in the act and they've been let go. I mean, yeah, it's not a scientific, statistically proven study, but I noticed from my personal experience that the brown man and the black man and colored person who can't speak as well English will get in trouble more often for the same reason that a white man or woman might be let go for.
Hmm. Do you think that's a human universal or specific to political contexts?
It's a tough question. I'm gonna go with I don't know.
Okay. I don't think I do either. I think the strangest thing about the politics of race is the friendships with quote foreigners that I've had, which were deeper and more real than the friendships with white people that I had had. I mean, there's white people on the same level, but I mean, there's this very strange notion that creeps in that like as a white podcast host, I can't understand you as a brown skinned person from Saudi, and you can't understand me. And if I say something that is against something you believe, that's probably just an example of my white privilege. And
Mm.
uh, as a very different portrayal of human, or I mean, it's an identity politics that groups human beings before their individuality as their group identity.
Hmm.
And I mean, clearly, you grew up in a theocracy um, that was extremely repressive in a lot of ways, and that taught you religion from a young age. And yet, you're planning to study medicine in the United States and have a deep account of evolutionary biology. And yeah, it's to take your Saudi Arabian identity before your individual identity, I think would be absolutely absurd.
Right, I agree, 100%.
Um, let's see. I think we can at least jump through one or two more hoops here.
Oh yeah, sure, definitely. I like this.
Uh, when when approaching like a general conversation about the Middle East, what do you think is what do you think Americans in their assumptions on average, or maybe conservative or liberal Americans, are really missing the mark on? Um, I don't just like an interesting example that I've thought of was we have sort of radical feminist movement, part of the Me Too movement, but you could separate it from it in the United States. That is the same group of people that will call you Islamophobic for saying that prescribed burqas are a bad idea for women.
Ooh, you might have triggered me right there. See, I I I identify as a person who leans to the left, and I mean, actually, I don't know what I identify as, but I see more often than not my opinions align with the left and a little bit more liberal. But if there's anything I hate more or hate the most about liberals and people who, social justice warrior, is when they comment about the hijab. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that in this time and age, we cannot recognize bad culture from good culture. I mean, the Mayans had a beautiful culture, but they used to sacrifice humans. It should we sacrifice humans too because we accept all cultures? No, no. You know, Muslims kill women after adultery for honor reasons. That's culture. Should we agree to that? Why is that accepted into this understanding that we should be passive about all cultures because everybody's right and nobody's wrong all at the same time? I feel like it's nonsense. It's nonsense, and the hijab is definitely one of them. It's treated as this cultural fashion statement. It's bullshit. If a woman, it could be. If a woman has a free choice of when and where to wear her hijab, I completely support her choice. But the fact of the matter is, the majority. I don't want to put a percentage, but like the majority of the women don't get a say in it, and they're raised to love the hijab, to want to wear it, to hide their hair from a man. I mean, I don't know. If we don't have to accept that part of culture, we really don't. Not as white men or brown or black or yellow or green. It's just not a proper way to live, where you tell somebody what to wear every day of their life since they hit puberty until they believe they want it. It's not right. And anybody who says that this is part of culture, um, I mean, it's just I would rather call them an apologist, really. Yeah.
I think that was beautifully said. Although now you're gonna get called an Uncle Tom and a Western apologist. And
Right, right. Yeah, the Western apologist.
yeah, let's take the other side of the coin to steelman any liberals who might be listening to us. And um, I mean, certainly post 9/11, there was a large stigma of Muslims, particularly on the conservative side, and people treating Sikhs as if they were Muslims, which I think is hilarious given the.
Given the history,
um, but there's certainly, I think there's an implicit narrative that can happen on the right that the Middle East or Arabs more generally are sort of barbaric.
Mm, mm, mm.
Um, I mean, you could see in certain countries like Pakistan, with the capital punishment things in Saudi Arabia, you could see where that perception comes out of.
Right.
But I guess I'm going to leave this as open ended without doing a topic. What do you see that the fault of the conservative wing in U.S. politics is when viewing the Middle East and or Muslims generally?
I mean, the main problem is that they don't view the Middle East. They don't view Islam as a subject. They view it as a topic, as a subtopic in relation to the great nation US of A, right? I think that's a big fault because it leads to a lot of mis misunderstandings and really lack of true interest in truth about that topic. For example, there's no conservative, or no, I don't want to say that. Never mind. I'm not speaking in absolutes. There are the classic conservative view that would be wrong is that when they look at Islam, they look at Islam in the US. They look at Islam as it relates to the Western culture. But is it though? Is that how you understand the subject? When we go out and use the scientific method and we want to study physics, do we only study physics in relation to our own house and how it stands? No, we understand it as a subject. When we go out and we try to understand Descartes' methods or Machiavelli's discourses? Do we go and read them as it pertains solely to the Italian culture, or do we look at it as a true philosophical insight that these men had? I mean, this is the choice I think a lot of conservatives are making, where they look through a very tight lens that leads to the rest of the world seeing them as bigots and seeing them as ignorant or insensitive because they are looking through this very small lens that they refuse to look anywhere else.
Yeah, I've actually I really like that distinction between subject and sort of uh, in relation to.
Mm, mm,
There is something universal about a subject and
mm,
something human about a true subject, I would say.
mm.
There's no such thing as Christian physics or Muslim algebra. Uh,
Right, right,
though Christians did invent physics and Muslims invent algebra.
right, right, right.
I think that's a quote actually from Sam Harris. Um,
Well, the Greeks invented physics, but sure.
no, real physics. Not the
Right, right, yeah, yeah. Newton,
Newton
Tony,
Galilei.
right, right. Newton.
It's funny. I was talking to an older person. This was a few years ago,
Mm.
and I was talking to her about my Indian friend Arman, and I think she had seen pictures of me and him, and she was like, "Is Arman a Muslim?" And me being belligerent as I am, I said, "He's a member of ISIS, but he's really a nice guy." I
Um,
experienced that. It's yeah, and I think I mean that's just what happens when fear enters the picture about any people or subject,
mm,
is you can only see it in relationship to you.
mhm.
Um, I think that the real study of Islam, for instance, Pakistan and India and that history is far more interesting than Islam in the West. And I think there's a very underplayed element in the media and in the way we tend to talk about the subjects that it's
Please.
always West and East centric. But the United States and Western culture per se, if we could talk about that as a concept, is not the only culture that is conflicting with sort of fundamentalist Islamist ideas.
Mhm.
So I really like that distinction. Um, I mean, do you have major ideological differences between you and family members? I mean, sharing some of the views you've shared. Is there, do you bite your lip often when talking to them?
Well, are we
Uh,
talking about extended family or are we talking about immediate family?
you could do both if whatever's interesting or
Sure.
special.
Extended family, definitely. A lot of them are religious, and those that aren't religious do believe in God. So I do bite my lip more often than not. Um, with immediate family, it's less than an ideological difference, and rather than how how much you know. I'm an atheist. I'm not a militant atheist. My dad is a militant atheist. I'm non-religious. I'm not very spiritual, but my mom is non-religious, but she is spiritual. My sister, on the other hand, she takes a more Western view on religion, where she is an atheist, but she doesn't really care much for that conversation. Like, she identifies as an atheist for the sake of identifying to have a name, but she really doesn't go into the conversation. And I think these are the differences between me and my family. But we still communicate. I still am thankful for how open they are, how lucky I was. I mean, what are the chances to find two atheist parents in the same family? I mean, walking down the street in Saudi Arabia, you need to walk a couple of years before you find an atheist. So I'm definitely thankful for that, and it really helped a lot of times. If I cannot imagine if my parents were religious too, and at that time I was an atheist, I might have just converted to Islam, honestly, because it's just so difficult. But because of them, because of some friends I had in high school, I had this oasis where sometimes I can share my thoughts.
Hmm. That's the biggest anomaly I've ever heard. Although, maybe he noticed something. You can spot atheists in a crowd.
Right.
They're usually pointing out something about geology or weather.
And that is why we never talk about geology in the Middle East.
Have you ever been in a debate with a sort of fundamentalist or conservative Muslim where you were sort of, you weren't revealing what you actually believe, but you were pushing them on something?
Dude, that's where I had trouble. As a teenager with teenage angst, I loved these conversations, and I would share too much sometimes. Sometimes I would try to argue, like from a non-religious, but I still believe in God perspective. But I'd get lost in it, and I'd start aggressively arguing. So I've definitely argued with a few fundamentalists before. And what I've noticed after 23 years of life is that arguing is completely useless with a fundamentalist. You can only nod and smile, and sometimes you can cynically point out things for your own entertainment. But other than that, it's largely useless. And I don't mean that condescendingly. I mean, to him too, it would be useless, him or her. It would be useless to argue with me. I do not mean this condescendingly. I just mean we are so far apart on the spectrum that a true discussion is not possible because the very basic truths are disagreed upon, and they disagree upon with me based on faith, and I disagree based on what I call scientific evidence. And so the a true exchange of knowledge is dead before it was born. And I think for both parties, it's a useless endeavor, and then it's just energy draining, honestly.
Did you read Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy?
I have, but it was a while ago.
um, there's this really cool esoteric reading of that text that the reason he's doing a meditation is because he can't say what he means, but he has to show people who are willing to meditate with him. Uh,
Mhm.
it's one of the most interesting works where you're dealing with fundamentalism, but Descartes' aim is to create a metaphysics such that the scientific method is possible.
Oh yeah,
So
I think I mean that's why I'm not Descartes. He is. It's just a genius. Absolutely. I remember what you're talking. I don't remember the text specifically, but I remember what you're talking about. The way he injected the scientific method into what was supposed to be a prologue to a scientific piece, where he appeases the church. Like this work was meant to appease the church, and he injected the fundaments of scientific method. Is absolutely genius. I cannot do it. I'm jealous of people who can.
at least not yet.
Right.
It's a brilliant way to go about it. I'm going to doubt everything in existence, and then I'm going to conclude that I exist and God exists.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
The only things I can know a priori. If that's not the best medicine for a fundamentalist, I don't know what is.
Right.
So, um, I think we do a couple closing questions, but who
Sure.
is the Western and Eastern thinker or philosopher that is your favorite or has influenced you the most, and why? I mean, Western and Eastern.
I would say in the West it would be Machiavelli, and in the East it would be Al-Ghazali, and for very different reasons. I think Machiavelli, for me, it wasn't much of what he said. He said great things, and it definitely changed what I think about it. But it was how the information was given to me, and I think it was given so skillfully that for about 6 months I assumed the persona of Machiavelli. It was really great to really understand the birth of the modern Western culture, of how truly how the Pope and the political authority divorced one another.
Mm.
It was beautiful. Yeah. So I would definitely say Machiavelli. In the East, it's Ghazali, but not for what he said that I agree with, but rather for what he said that I don't agree with. A lot of people like what he said, but for me, he marks the downfall of a prosperous Islamic empire in the 12th century. I don't honestly, I don't remember. Don't quote me on this, but I don't remember the exact historical date. But he popularizes the idea that the study of religion is more important than the study of science,
Mm.
and I think for me that's such a significant thing to say. That is absolutely ridiculous.
There's also just like a very strange contradiction embedded in it, which is
Hmm.
assuming that the universe has a creator and that human beings have a creator, then the study of nature would, in some sense, be the study of the designer and its will.
Hmm. I feel like okay. I don't want to be unfair to the works of Arab and Islamic thinkers. I will think of a positive influence. There is Ibn Rushd.
Mhm.
He's an Andalusian Muslim polymath. Um, he was
Avicenna.
what is it?
Avicenna.
Oh no, not Avicenna is different. This is in English. I believe he's referred to as Averroes.
Ah,
Ibn Rushd. He
yeah.
lived in Spain when it was Andalus, and he came actually after Al Ghazali, and he wrote a book to dispute what Al Ghazali said. Al Ghazali wrote a book said the incoherence of mind, and he wrote a book that said the incoherence of incoherence. And I think he was just a badass thinker at that time, for sure. And I really wish that his work was more influential than it was, because if it was more influential, I do believe that the history of the of the Arab world would have been very different.
Hmm. It wasn't Al Ghazali, someone who said that numbers are the work of the devil and that mathematics is.
That's out of context slightly.
Okay.
I'm not saying he has good ideas to say about numbers, but this specific quote is out of context. He says to indulge yourself in the study of numbers to the point where you ignore God is the work of the devil. And so you can see here where he is prioritizing the study of religion over the study of science.
Hmm. And is Ibn Rushd censored in Saudi Arabia, or did you have access to his?
Ibn Rushd, I really don't know because I anyways downloaded it illegally. uh, I'm not sure if it's censored. A lot of books are censored in Saudi Arabia, that's for sure. But I'm not sure if Ibn Rushd is one of them.
Hmm. So, I mean, I'm just curious, as a quick side note, who are the current is like Muslim thinkers who are the most popular as givers of an interpretation of Islam?
Oh, uh, so imams are always going to be very influential. There's the Imam of Egypt. I forget his name honestly. I apologize, but the Imam of Egypt is the most influential at this point, and he is honestly. I think he's too old to be consistent. He has so many varying points about different things. I mean, he condemns ISIS but supports the Islamic Brotherhood. He condemns Israel but condemns Hamas as well. He can he's just an inconsistent man, and I think that's very fitting for the current state of the Islamic world, which is inconsistent and chaotic. He's very representative of what's going on.
Hmm. And that, I mean, a lot of people argue that that has more to do with politics than religion.
Uh, the politics is an object. So the way I think of it is politics is an object, and the forces pushing it is religion.
Hmm. Um, and you've lived in various Middle Eastern countries,
Oh,
including.
sorry to interrupt you. I just because I'm
Oh,
thinking of the name really hard, and I finally found it, and I want to give accurate information. It's Tantawi, Muhammad al-Tantawi. That is the Imam of something called Al Azhar, which is an Islamic school in Egypt, the biggest Islamic school.
hmm. It's a very nice guy.
Yeah, right.
Which would you say is the Middle Eastern country that is the most secular?
Hmm. Syria was the most secular before the civil war. Definitely. Um, but after the civil war, and since it's not secular anymore, Tunis, Tunisia is the most secular right now. Although that secularism is being threatened by a lot of Islamic political parties. That's the problem with democracy in places like this. You allow for democracy, and then once you do, you watch the bad forces take over because that's what the populace wants, and it's very painful. I try to avoid news about Tunis because honestly, truly, it is painful for me to listen to news about it because it's such a beautiful country, very secular, very advanced, both educationally and economically. For the small size that it represents, it's a very small country, and it's just painful. Yeah, they try to follow a democratic framework, and in the end, they give up. They give up everything for religious part.
Hmm. There's this in Plato's Republic, I think, where Socrates describes how the manner in which democracies fall, and it's always when the masses become infatuated with a tyrant.
Yes, sir. Yeah, and the tyrant here is history.
Uh, we usually end our book podcast with a life lesson per se, um,
Hmm,
and so I was wondering if, well, I guess I'll ask you two questions along those lines.
sure.
Um, One, what lesson has your, I guess, multiculturalism developed from living in these places? What's one major lesson that that has given you through experience?
I mean, it's I've learned a lot of cliche things. I don't have a I don't have a poetic thing to say that is not cliche. I think the biggest thing that I learned from my multicultural experiences is that while humans and their cultures can be so different, within each culture, well, between each culture, there are various similarities. There's just as much as there's a conservative, racist American somewhere who has a neo-Nazi tattoo. There's a ISIS fighter somewhere in the desert of Syria killing people, and I think that really gave me an anthropological understanding of humanity. Really, that we really are just apes who have recently evolved, and while we shouldn't be so hard on ourselves, we also have to fight very hard against extinction. And I think it doesn't matter where you're from, as long as you have a specific, not specific, but a moral approach to life that truly cares about the truth. Then I think you're fine.
I think you might be more American than most Americans. The last one, I know some people who are cousins, and then other people's cousins or sisters that are going to university next year. And I was wondering what advice you would give a young intellectual or a blossoming intellectual about how to approach learning in like sort of the first mature context of their life.
I think the easiest thing to do that is wrong is to believe that your intellectualism somehow makes you better prepared for things that happen to you, or better than other people, or better in any way, really. Intellectual is really what people miss about intellectuality. It's not about becoming a sophisticated person who can drink tea and speak about whatever. It's it's more about for your own mature for the very maturity of your own mind. It doesn't make you better. It doesn't prepare you better for some events that happen to you. It just makes your lubricates your mind. On the long run, it will help you in life. But as a budding intellectual, don't don't overburden your intellectualism with things. Like, don't say, "Oh, I'm not an intellectual because I haven't read this," or "I have to react to this situation in a specific way because I'm an intellectual. I'm better than somebody because it's not like that. It really isn't. I think being intellectual is such a actually easy thing these days with the availability of knowledge. And I think everybody should go for it.
Well, Mir, thank you so much. If only more of humanity were like you.
Oh no.
We might not have Zionists, Hamas, and the IRA.
Maybe.
All
Thank you
right.
very much. Thank you very much for having me. This was a very fun conversation as usual, Max.
It was more fun than I could have imagined.
Always. My only regret is that it cannot go on longer, and that I cannot smoke a cigarette while talking to you, because it just feels much better.
Now there's an Arab stereotype.
we do all smoke. That's true.
Pack a day keeps the doctor away.
There you go.
All right. Well, I don't think we've exhausted any of the things we've covered by any means. So if anyone's listening, please drop a comment or a question, and I will make sure to have Amir back on, and we will talk about it. I think coming up next on The Specialist, there's going to be an emergency medical technician, and then finally this crazy Indian psychologist we've been talking so much about, Arman, on the psychology and treatment addiction.
The one, the only, Arman Sharma.
There's no more beautiful name, not even Helen of Troy. All right. Thank you so much for listening.